evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate with us during this Mary Ward Week. Our history, the history of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the Loretto Sisters, is of course related to Mary Ward, who founded the Institute in 1609. When she died in 1645, Mary thought that her life had been a failure. She never gained Vatican approval for her religious congregation, and her convents and schools were closed by papal decree. After many years, Mary Ward was vindicated, and she came to be recognized even by future popes as a holy woman. The constitutions she wanted were approved, and her followers could call her founder. In fact, the English Cardinal Boring said of her in 1921, "It is a duty of gratitude to recall continually that the very existence of modern educational and charitable congregations as we know them was made possible by the spiritual foresight, heroic perseverance, and terrible sufferings and disappointments of Mary Ward. To no one after their own founders do religious owe a greater debt of gratitude than to Mary Ward." Credit for the almost incredible, and we say miraculous, story of the survival of Mary Ward's Institute goes to a small group of faithful followers who defied authorities and continued to keep her vision alive while they ministered in secret on the continent and in England after Mary Ward's death. Today, about 2,000 IBVM and CJ followers of Mary Ward carry on her mission around the world on all 5 continents. Almost 2 centuries after Mary Ward's death, Frances Teresa Ball founded the Loretto branch of the Institute in Ireland in 1821. She responded to calls to send sisters to many parts of the world before she died in 1861. One of those was Teresa Dease, for whom tonight's lecture is named. She left Ireland with 4 others in 1847. They arrived in Toronto on September 16th and found a city under siege because of the typhus or cholera epidemic that claimed thousands of lives, a bit like Toronto today. And it's perhaps fitting that we're here on Zoom rather than meeting in person. Within a couple of years, due to harsh living conditions in part, the superior died, and young Teresa found herself appointed General Superior, a position she held until just after her death in 1889. Under her leadership, the Loretto Sisters established academies for girls and founded Catholic elementary schools that still exist in Guelph, Niagara Falls, Hamilton, Stratford, and of course the Greater Toronto area. Later, the Institute continued to spread to Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Illinois, Michigan, Arizona, and California. In the story of each of these foundations, we see that, like Mary Ward, Teresa Dease valiantly persisted in overcoming obstacles from both church and civil authorities. She challenged prevailing norms while retaining peace of mind and serenity, relying on a steadfast hope in God's providence and a strong and well-placed confidence in the zeal of her sisters. I think it is safe to say of Teresa Dease what Cardinal Boring said of Mary Ward, that we have a duty of gratitude to recall the contribution she made to the Church in North America. Teresa was a true pioneer in the education of girls and in making Catholic education available to any parent who wanted it for their children. So tonight, we offer you the Teresa Dease Lecture as a tribute to the mostly unsung founder of IBVM in North America, 175 years after her arrival in Toronto. Thank you. And now Mary will introduce our speaker.
Before we begin our presentation, I'd just like to encourage attendees to use the chat box to submit their questions to our speaker afterwards. So I am pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight's lecture. Dr. Susan K. Wood is a Sister of Charity of Leavenworth, Kansas. She is the first female academic dean of Regis College, and she also serves as Professor of Systematic Theology. After earning an MA degree in French at Middlebury College and a PhD in theology at Marquette University, Dr. Wood taught at St. Mary's College in Leavenworth, Kansas, St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, and Marquette University in Milwaukee. She served as Associate Dean at St. John's for 5 years and 8 years as Department Chair at Marquette. She is a past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. More importantly, Dr. Wood has a passion for ecumenism and the question of the Church's place in the world. She has served on several Catholic Christian dialogues and consultations. She has also participated in consultations on baptism, theological anthropology, and the nature and purpose of ecumenical dialogue sponsored by the World Council of Churches. Most of her writing explores the connections between ecclesiology and sacramental theology. Dr. Wood received the John Courtney Murray Award from the Catholic Theological Society of America in 2021 for outstanding and distinguished achievement in theology. We are honored to have her with us tonight. Welcome, Dr. Wood.
Thank you very much for your very generous and kind introduction, and thank you for the Sisters of Loretto for this invitation. I can't imagine a more fitting week to celebrate Mary Ward Week than the Week for Christian Unity, and I'm grateful to be able to speak about ecumenism tonight. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. I have a PowerPoint here, so you don't have to look at me for the entirety of the talk. So my title, kind of provocatively, is Beyond Spiritual Ecumenism and Ecumenical Spirituality. And that title, an ecumenical spirituality, is of course part of spiritual ecumenism, but my message tonight is that what we do ecumenically has an application in many applications in our lives as Christians in other areas than church unity. So spiritual ecumenism is defined by the document of Vatican II, Unitatis Redintegratio, which is the decree on ecumenism, as this change of heart and holiness of life. And I can't see my own screen because I have to move the Zoom stuff. Okay, this change of heart and holiness of life, along with public and private prayer for the unity of Christians, should be regarded as the soul of the whole ecumenical movement and merits the name spiritual ecumenism. The ecumenical movement, as you know, is the movement for the work for the full visible unity of Christian churches. And that unity as the goal of ecumenism is different from the goal of interreligious dialogue, which is for mutual understanding. So tonight I am strictly speaking of ecumenism and not interreligious dialogue. Okay, it's not advancing. Okay, there we go. It involves an increase of fidelity of the church to its calling. Spiritual ecumenism has to do with those presuppositions and preconditions for ecumenical unity. And the first of these is fidelity to who we are, because before we can enter into conversation with another, we have to be authentic in our own identity. And so this means that the church needs continual reformation. One of my favorite lines in the documents of Vatican II is Lumen Gentium 8, which says that the church should be at once holy and always ought to be purified, simul sancta et semper purificanda. I don't spout the Latin to show off, but to show that there's a resonance in the conciliar text with that famous line of Lutheran theology, simul justus et peccator, that a person is at once justified and a sinner. And this text is so close to that there's an ecumenical resonance there. And the decree on ecumenism says there's nothing so foreign to the spirit of ecumenism as a false Irenicism which harms the purity of Catholic doctrine and obscures its genuine and certain meaning. So it's not like we're just supposed to be nice to one another, and that's ecumenism. That we have to face our difficulties and differences face straight on, but nevertheless, by becoming clear of who we are, we can enter into this encounter and engagement with another. So some of the elements of church renewal that would be involved with this are the biblical and liturgical movements, which help to prepare for the Second Vatican Council, the preaching of the Word of God and the renewal of biblical studies, which also was another major movement preparing for the Second Vatican Council, renewal of catechetics, the apostolate of the laity, new forms of religious life, the development of a spirituality of married life, and also the church's social teaching and activity. So it's actually every aspect of the church contributes to its renewal. In addition to church renewal, we're called to interior conversion. I would invite you all to kind of go into a little thought experiment at this time. If you have a longing for conversion, what is the nature of that longing? What change do you wish to have to occur within yourself? I can tell I think a humorous story on myself. Once I was setting out, I was invited to teach a course at the Gregorian in Rome, and I thought, oh, I need to be converted. Maybe this would be the place. And somebody said to me, you expect Rome to be the place for a conversion? And they were right. But at any rate, interior conversion involves a kind of a newness of attitude of mind, a change of heart where we ask ourselves, who do I love? Holiness of life, again, of kind of a fun thought game I play with students is, what is holiness? And sometimes people think of angels or saints with halos in icons, or something that is ethereal or removed from human life, or kind of being set apart on a pedestal. And none of this is holiness. What's really interesting is that Vatican II in Lumen Gentium number 4 on the chapter on the universal call to holiness defines holiness as perfection in love. And that's something that we are all obviously called to in our individual life situations. And then ultimately, conversion may call for a change in behavior of some way, to get rid of bad habits and replace them with good habits, or to do acts of charity, or to care for the poor in certain ways. But so this, all of these are aspects of interior conversion. Within that, we can also say that conversion is ultimately, and first of all, a conversion to the full truth of Jesus Christ, the Christological center of ecumenism. One of the things that binds all Christian churches together is their belief in the triune God and in Jesus Christ as a true God and true man come to dwell among human people on this earth. And it's the renewal of that which will center us and enable us to enter into relationship with one another. Sometimes people talk about the ecumenical movement as being in a winter or in an ice age, and people get bored with it. They get tired because they don't see a lot of progress, or they wonder, isn't diversity wonderful and variety good? So what's wrong with there being lots of different kinds of churches? And my answer is there's nothing wrong with that, and there will remain to be different historical groups because we don't erase that historicity or that particularity in ecumenism. But what's wrong is when we hurl anathemas at one another, condemn one another, judge one another, dismiss one another. And so it's this return to the vibrancy of the first generation Christians and being more radically converted to the gospel in Christ is where we need to find our renewal. So maybe the first conversion is that we need to be excited again by the gospel. Conversion also requires repentance for certain exclusions, refusals to forgive, insistence on condemning the other side, unevangelical pride, disdain born of an unhealthy presumption. That's Saint Pope John Paul II's list of things to repent for in his encyclical Ut Unum Sint, which was his great encyclical on ecumenism in 1995. It's also an ongoing reformation. The Catholic Church is also a church of the Reform. It's not just Protestant church, it's our church of the Reform. So when you go back to the Council of Trent in 1645, if you read the chapters, you have a chapter on doctrine, then a section or chapter on reform of the church, followed by a section on doctrine, followed by another reform section. It was actually a reforming council. And some of the reforms it was trying to accomplish, it told bishops they had to live in their see, even though maybe life was more interesting in Paris or the great cities than down on the farm. It established seminaries because the Catholic Church has been trying to improve preaching forever. So these are some elements of reform. And just like Vatican II was a reform in many ways. So it's in the Counter-Reformation is now called by historians the Catholic Reformation. So Reformation is something shared by other Christian groups with the Catholic Church. And this Reformation is an ongoing, never-ending event in the life of the Church. And so the next point is that it's not a once-for-all act. Conversion is not. But conversion, just like Reformation, is a never-ending process that we are always called to return to our origins, to our center, to a closer orientation to Christ. And then finally, conversion is both personal and communal. That we speak of our personal conversions, but we're also called to conversion as a church or an ecclesial community. That there are both the collective and the individual dimensions to this. So spiritual ecumenism is the precondition for work for full visible unity of Christian churches. And the unity of Christian churches happens through two arms that are most evident in the World Council of Churches. There's first the theological work of faith and order through ecumenical dialogue, but there's also the practical ecumenism of life and work, which often happens at the grassroots level in terms of parish communities or individual Christians or schools. So it's both, it's not just about doctrine, but it's also about working together for the mission of the church. So that's spiritual ecumenism. Now I turn to what is an ecumenical spirituality that supports that that supports the ecumenical movement and spiritual ecumenism. So what is spirituality? Well, there's probably many different ways that people describe what that may be. But in general, we can say that spirituality encompasses the attitudes, convictions, and practices which orient the lives of women and men towards their relationship with God and other people. So it's kind of a state of mind, it's dearly held beliefs, and how we act, is the large focus of spirituality. And so spirituality really is a way of life that has both a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension. We might call it spirituality from above, which is the working of God's Spirit, because Spirit is really the core of spirituality and refers to the Holy Spirit influencing the life of an individual or a community. But we can also talk about as a way of life from below, because it's lived out in concrete human conditions, contexts, in social environments, so that it's not just an ethereal kind of a belief system or a feeling or something that kind of floats above the real world, but it's spirituality is concretized and embodied and incarnated in human conditions, context, and social conditions. Now, if it probably would help to think of some examples of what we can recognize as distinctive spiritualities. So there are spiritualities of different religious communities. There's Jesuits with an Ignatian spirituality, Franciscans with the spirituality of St. Francis, St. Dominic and the Dominicans. I may have some Dominican friends listening to this. A friend once told me that you have to have a vocation to study to be a Dominican, because that's part of their spirituality. I'm a Sister of Charity of Leavenworth. We have a Vincentian spirituality, which is very much connected with service to the poor and with bridging the distances between rich and poor. So there are different spiritualities of different communities, which they're all living the same Christian life, but they just have a different flavor, which involves attitudes, convictions, and practices. We can think of Eastern Christian spirituality, and we think of the monasticism that comes out of that spirituality. We think of Byzantine chant. We think of the liturgy of St. Chrysostom. We think of incense. We think of icons. All of that, which again are flavors of a spirituality that comes from the East. There's also a spirituality of the West in Reformation churches, very much centered on the Word of God and Scripture. We also, when I think of my Lutheran friends, and because I've been most involved with dialogue with Lutherans, Part of their spirituality is their intense dedication to the doctrine of justification and their conviction that grace is freely given. And so there's a different foci for different spiritualities. They're not necessarily contradictory, but complementary to one another. So that's an example of what spirituality is. And so what I want to explore further tonight is what might be entailed in what I'm calling an ecumenical spirituality. Now, there's some obvious overlap between spiritual ecumenism, as I described it in the first part of this talk, and ecumenical spirituality. So obviously, spiritual ecumenism entails an ecumenical spirituality that is, as we've already seen, it's Christological. It's a baptismal spirituality because the commonality of all Christian churches is our recognition of one another's baptism in the name of the triune God. And that's a kind of a sacramental spirituality that is embodied in sign and symbol and words. It's a prayerful spirituality because we pray, like this week, for Christian unity. And the other thing we have to say about an ecumenical spirituality is that it's ecclesial, it's communal, and that when we're engaged in ecumenical spirituality, we think with the church. Now, St. Ignatius has some rules for thinking with the church that I'm not going to go through tonight, but what I really like is Pope Francis's interpretation of what it means to think with the church, and he is a Jesuit. And for Pope Francis, you know, if you're going to think with the church, you have to first of all figure out what is the church, where is the church, who is the church. And sometimes when we think about thinking with the church, we think we're thinking with the hierarchy. But the hierarchy is not the whole church. The people are the church. And so for Francis to think with the church, he gets really down to the nitty gritty, and he says, if you think, to think with the church is to be in touch with the people of the church and their needs and their longings and their desires. And so this kind of broadens our notion of thinking with the church isn't just following all the rules, but it's really being in touch with God's people. Two things, I think, add to this ecumenical spirituality that beyond its overlap with spiritual ecumenism, although there's probably still overlap here. And even though this is a long quote from John Paul II, I'm going to read it because it says so well what a spirituality of communion is. So the two elements I'm going to add to baptismal, Christological, prayerful, ecclesial is I'm going to say that, and what I think an ecumenical spirituality is, it's a spirituality of communion, and the second is going to be, it's a dialogical spirituality. So first, a spirituality of communion. A spirituality of communion means an ability to think of our brothers and sisters in faith within the profound unity of the mystical body, and therefore as those who are a part of me. This makes us able to share their joys and sufferings, to sense their desires and attend to their needs, to offer them deep and genuine friendship, A spirituality of communion implies also the ability to see what is positive in others, to welcome it and prize it as a gift from God, not only as a gift for the brother or sister who has received it directly, but also as a gift for me. A spirituality of communion means, finally, to know how to make room for our brothers and sisters, bearing each other's burdens, and resisting the selfish temptations which constantly beset us and provoke competition, careerism, distrust, and jealousy. Let us have no illusions. Unless we follow this spiritual path, external structures of communion will serve very little purpose. They would become mechanisms without a soul, masks of communion rather than its means of expression and growth. Okay, let's take a look at this. First sentence, my brothers and sisters are part of me. The interconnectedness between people that, part of me is you. And so we share joys and sufferings, attend to needs, and exist in friendship. An ecumenical spirituality is relational before it's anything else. The core of ecumenical relationships is friendship and deep respect of others. A spirituality of communion is positive, not negative. And one of the things we talk about in ecumenism is an ecumenical gift exchange, where one tradition preserves something in the Christian tradition and then offers it at a historical moment and is received by another tradition. But this is also, at a personal level, in terms of ecumenical friendship, we welcome the friend as a gift that we receive from another. And then we make room. We have a space within us to receive another. And we avoid, the negativity of competition and so on. And so unless we have this relationality, unless we have this personal gift exchange, unless we have a sense of together we make a whole, external structures of communion serve little purpose. So Walter Kasper, who's a former president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, notes in reference to this quote by John Paul II, that without such a spirituality of communion, institutional communion becomes a mere machine without a soul. And note again that spirituality of communion is not just my personal spirituality, but that personal spirituality cannot be developed except in relationship to another. Again, to develop this concept further, a spirituality of communion, let's talk about what communion is. Communion is not uniformity. If you have just one thing that is uniform and whole, it's a monad. There's no differentiation in it. One of the preconditions for true communion, because the word communion actually means union with. So communion means union with another. You cannot be united with another if you turn into one thing. There has to be difference. So a presupposition for communion is unity in difference, not absorption into a one. This means that we recognize the other person, our dialogue partner, in his or her otherness. And we can't remove their otherness, or else we can't be in communion with them. It almost sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? And this is a unity in diversity. That diversity is actually required at some level for unity. And as I mentioned before, with reference to the quote, we call this, and Margaret O'Gara, I'd love to acknowledge her today in this week of Christian unity. She's a great ecumenist. She was a good personal friend of mine and a former professor at St. Michael's College. She has a book called The Ecumenical Gift Exchange, but it's also a term that is used by John Paul II in Untitled. That and I think this is so important because ecumenism does not erase our histories when we come into union with one another. It does not erase all differences. We don't jump over, with Reformation churches, over 500 years of difference. But we have to transcend those differences and unite them in a greater unity, not a lower unity, a greater unity, in recognition of and respect of the otherness of others. This is often really misunderstood. In the 19th century, in Mortalium Animos, which was an encyclical that defined Ecumenism as a return to Rome, which is really not ecumenical, Catholics sometimes still think the goal is for everybody to become Catholic, and ecumenism is for everybody to return to Rome. No, it's more like the honeycomb here, where you have a whole and you have a unity, but you're maintaining that respectfulness of otherness. The second thing is that we have a dialogical spirituality. I think I actually had some nice little pictures, but this form of this particular slides, they're not here for some reason. But anyway, if you can imagine a dialogue with two people with balloons, out of their head, walking along and talking to one another, it involves an encounter. And of course, an encounter is always with the other. And so dialogical spirituality is related to another. And there's a document that was issued by the joint working group between the Roman Catholic Church and the World Council of Churches called The Nature and Purpose of Ecumenical Dialogue. And in it, it talks about a walking together of fellow pilgrims. And it uses pilgrimage as an image for this dialogical spirituality. And so as these pilgrims are walking along, each partner speaks from his or her context, from his or her perspective of viewing the world. And they communicate that experience, and as much as is possible, they try to enter into the experience of the other and see the other's perspective through their eyes. And they say, there's the spelling here, a successful ecumenist can articulate the partner's perspective not only so that the partner recognizes it as her own, but sometimes better than she can articulate it herself. To know another person's position so well that you can articulate it as if you yourself stood and held that stood in that position and held it. And so the key here is to look through the eyes as much as is possible. We can't do that. We know we can't. But to see the world through the perspective of another. Okay, I'll just continue before I interrupt myself again. Okay, and a fusion, what we have here then is a fusion of horizons so each partner has a horizon, when they look out from their own eyes, and you've got two people looking together, shoulder to shoulder, towards the same goal, which would be, fidelity to Jesus Christ, for an example. And then their horizons fuse so they can see it together as much as possible. This is probably asymptotic in that we might get closer and closer to another person's perspective without those lines ever quite touching. But nevertheless, to look through another lens. Dialogue also has a cruciform pattern. It's an intersection of relationship with God and with one another. So again, the cruciform, the vertical, the horizontal, the spiritual relationship with God, the horizontal in terms of relationship with one another, because this dialogue occurs in a very respectful, sacred context. The aim of this dialogue is not to convince the other of the truth of this, that, or the other thing, but to understand another in a deep way. So we see that this dialogical spirituality is a spirituality of encounter. It involves a certain decentering of ourself in order to really see what value the other one is holding. So, for example, in ecumenical dialogue, it's important, I think, when we meet with church differences, is to ask ourselves, what is the value being protected in my dialogue partner's position? Not that they have an idea that's different from mine, but there's a value underneath the conceptual baggage of this. And if we can touch into that value, I think often enough we find ourselves sharing the value and differing perhaps on the carrier of that value. So again, to develop a little more of the idea of pilgrimage, dialogue is a word on a common journey, but it's in via, it's on the way, it's on the road. It's neither the first word nor the last word. And for academics, they can get paralyzed in their writing. And one of the things that frees up that paralysis is to say, what I'm writing is not the last word on this topic. It's a moment in a conversation. And so we have to look on this word on a common journey as a moment in an ongoing conversation. It's a moment between an already of past communal histories and a not yet of future. And a good example of this is the disciples on the road to Emmaus discussing the events of the crucifixion, and how in that dialogue they share, and then they reach the end of the journey, and they recognize the Lord in the breaking of the bread. Dialogue presents doctrine with a human face, because doctrines don't dialogue with one another, people do. And so when I talk to a friend, an ecumenical friend, about their cherished beliefs, those cherished beliefs are mediated through my friend and take on a human face. And this reflects a contextual experience of how belief is lived out. So it's not just doctrine on a page or an idea or a statement, but how it's infleshed in human life. And on this pilgrimage, if we engage in this dialogical journey, we engage in a healing of memories of our past. So there's a Lutheran Catholic document, From Conflict to Communion, and that document attempts to heal some of the memories of the painful memories of the Reformation by telling the story of the Reformation together, not apart or separately. Pope Francis picks up on this notion of interlocutors as fellow pilgrims when he says we must have sincere trust in our fellow pilgrims, putting aside all suspicion or mistrust, with our gaze focused on our common quest, the radiant peace of God's face. So, ecumenical spirituality brings with it ecumenical virtues. The first of these is humility, which is required to be open to another. And this openness is itself a virtue. Commitment and love is one of the virtues, and a discerning heart in the conversation, to discern the value, to discern the truth, to discern the friendship, to discern the sincerity of another. So the vast part of this presentation has really been developing the beyond ecumenical, spiritual ecumenism. And I've talked about an ecumenical spirituality. And unfortunately, the briefest part of this is the application, which is the beyond notion of this ecumenical spirituality that I have described in terms of the ecumenical movement and ecumenical dialogue and the relationship between churches, that if you are an ecumenist and you are formed by this ecumenical spirituality, it struck me when Sarah invited me to give this lecture that this is a way of life that is not limited to ecumenism. It's not limited to the relationship between churches, and that these attitudes and spiritual practices that constitute an ecumenical spirituality have an application for how we need to be in the world today. And so that one of the fundamental values of ecumenism is not just the relationship between churches, but it tells us how we need to be in the world that is so rife with conflict and brokenness today. So in terms of the Catholic Church, we're involved in a synod, studying synodality, which is the term itself means a walking with someone, a walking together. And so we see that an ecumenical spirituality is a presupposition for synodality, that we can't come together in a council or in a synod without this spirituality of communion, or without this dialogical spirituality, or without the virtues of the ecumenical virtues. And so ecumenism is the foundation, if you will, for synodality. It's, I would say, in a Canadian context, it helps us with reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, because it gives us the virtues, the practices, the attitudes, the spirituality to decenter ourselves and to listen to Indigenous peoples and their experience, and to see the world through their lens and this country through their lens, and to come to reconciliation with them. St. Mike's and Regis are involved in federating the two theological faculties. We're at the very, very beginning of implementation of this, and it's going to take a while. But it also strikes me that as Regis, with its Jesuit Ignatian identity and spirituality, and St. Mike's with its Basilian spirituality and lens, that if we treated the implementation of this as an ecumenical relationship, now we're much closer than two different churches, but if we treated it as an ecumenical relationship where we really took the time to decenter ourselves and ask the other, what is the value you most need to preserve in this federated entity, we'd be far down the road of coming together. Again, a unity in diversity, not a uniformity. Any conflictual situation that we find ourselves in, and I usually jump in with 2 feet, would be helped if we stepped back and considered the conflict through the lens of this ecumenical spirituality. Because all of these are examples of intentional decentering to hear and see as the other sees. And when we understand another in a deep way and have the humility and curiosity and respect to receive the other, then I think we touch, in touching that particularity of the other, we touch something that is common to both of us. Because there's a strange paradox with this, that the more we touch the particular and really get in touch with it, we experience the universal. And to translate that into ecumenical language, the more I understand the particularity of my dialogue partner, the more I understand the unity of the values we both hold. And then we sort out how we ever got on these different tracks. And so that's my story of the move from beyond spiritual ecumenism, an ecumenical spirituality. And I think we have some time for questions.
I think we do. First, I think we're going to have to take a breather for a moment and take in everything that you've said to us tonight, Susan. I'm reminded, that Teresa Dease, whose this lecture is named after, in her time back there, she was Mother Teresa in the 1800s. She always insisted that her sisters would be very competent in their field and well prepared for their classes. I think we can all agree you've done that tonight for us. And if you had any worries about coming across with mediocre stuff, I think you can forget that. It was wonderful. And I'm very grateful that we will be able to have this later on because it's been recorded and for people to be able to take it more. So I see that there are several questions in the chat room, so in the chat box. So let me just start you off with a few of them and then we'll go from there. Let's try this one first, and then since it's right here. Could ecumenical spirituality plant its seeds within the current synod think it is a presupposition for synodality?
I think absolutely. That's what I said kind of towards the end, that it's communion is one of the values of synodality. So this spirituality of communion is very much a part of that, and walking together and listening and the mutuality involved with that are common to both this ecumenical spirituality and the practice of synodality.
All right, another question. How do we enable the inclusion of voices of our ecumenical partners in the synodal process? How do we enable the inclusion of voices of our ecumenical partners?
That's really interesting because I don't know what the current what's currently be done for the current synod, but I could tell you that at the Vatican II there were Protestant observers who were not allowed to speak on the synod floor, but were very influential in the development of some of those documents of Vatican II, because they had full access to all the members of the council on all the coffee breaks, and they were consulted at different times and were able to give input back to the cardinals. So there was a very significant participation, even though they weren't speaking on the council floor. So that's what happened at Vatican II. Now, in terms of Protestant observers from other traditions, I don't know what the present synod is doing in terms of ecumenical partners.
All right, now this one is a long one, so bear with me here. What does a full, visible unity of Christian churches look like when communion requires difference? Have we achieved this full, visible unity with the ecumenical movement? If not, what are the obstacles that need to be overcome to achieve unity? And do you have some examples from your own practice of ecumenical dialogue that you could share?
Okay, have we achieved full visible unity? No, we haven't. We're not there yet. So that one is easy. What does it look like? We would say we have to have a common faith. We have to full visible unity from the Roman Catholic perspective requires unity with the Bishop of Rome. That itself is involved because in Ut Unum Sint, John Paul II's great encyclical on ecumenism, he invited all the churches of other traditions to help the Catholic Church think through the exercise of the papacy so that it would no longer be a stumbling block to unity. That's been done in a number of dialogues. And interestingly enough, I was telling my class this morning that there are several unofficial groups that are particularly working on this with the Orthodox. There's the Peter and Paul group, which is an unofficial study group. And then I've just been invited to join the St. Irenaeus group, which is another unofficial group of Catholics and Orthodox, working for that unity, because papal primacy is a particular stumbling block with the Orthodox. So that would be an example there. Full visible unity does not require uniformity. In the Roman Catholic Church, we already have a certain amount of diversity in that Eastern Catholic churches have their own code of canon law. They have an Eastern liturgical rite, which is the Liturgy of St. Chrysostom. They, can worship in their own languages like we do in the West. But the very fact that they have their own code of canon law and they have their own liturgical rite is an acknowledgement of a diversity of a culture and liturgical expression different from the West. I think this is a good model of what eventual unity can look like, is that you may have, these churches in union with Rome, but practicing a certain amount of independent polity, their own polity and prayer rites and spiritualities to some extent, just like we have that diversity already in Catholicism.
You need a breather?
We're okay.
Okay. Could ecumenical spirituality, I think I've asked you that one already, but the seeds. Is there a similarity with the concept and practice of restorative justice?
Interesting. I have to think for a minute on that one. Well, I think one concept in common, I'm not sure I know, I don't know restorative justice in a lot of detail, is that they're both forward thinking rather than focusing on the past. They're focusing on a creative future together. So I would say that is true. We're going forward on the road to a new reality and not just trying to, I think restorative isn't just focused on the past, a restoration of what was lost in the past, but, building on a promise for a future. So there might be some commonalities there. It's not tit for tat, it's not, okay, this was taken away and now this is what I'm going to give back to you. It's more that both entities are engaged in a renewal and a reformation now, which allows them to go forward together. So like there is a healing of memories of the past, that occurs, but the focus is on living now and enabling us to go without those burdens and that we carry. That's probably not too helpful, but that's about the best I can do.
Pretty good, I'd say, for just getting the question cold. Is there a similarity? Oh, that's twice down there. How should one approach an ecumenical spirituality, which to me presumes a loving, equality, and gentle demeanor? Navigate the anger and resentment in many conversations about race, gender, etc. today. So how should one approach an ecumenical spirituality, which to me presumes a loving equality and gentle demeanor? How do you navigate the anger and resentment in many of the conversations? Second part of this is a common belief these days in conversations of diversity, equity, inclusion is that some can speak and others shall only listen. How does that square with the goal to understand all?
Well, first of all, I would disagree that some should speak and others should only listen. A dialogue means both get to speak and both have to listen. There are so many parts to that, it's hard to hold them in my head. Probably the most important thing is how, an ecumenical spirituality implies a vulnerability and an openness to the other. And so the first part of that question was, how do you stay vulnerable and open in the face of anger and resentment? That was part of that question. And sometimes we have to absorb initial anger, and it has to just get expressed, and then you kind of absorb it, and then there's kind of you get it out, and then I think it's not to deny anger, but it's to say, what is the source of that anger? And to say why people are angry, what is the value that they sense is violated, which causes the anger, and then to explore that value. And then sometimes, the problem, okay, this is an example. It may not be a good example. So I watched a little bit of the news while I was eating supper tonight. And, there's the parade of trucks, protesting and angry about COVID restrictions here in Canada. And I was out doing errands on Saturday, and I was trying to cross Yonge Street, and there was a parade going down Yonge Street. Yonge Street is this street in Toronto where they route all the parades, and protests. They contain them on Yonge Street. And so I wanted to get from one side of the street to the other. And it was the anti-vaxxers that were protesting. And so when there's something similar about the trucks and the anti-vaxxers on Saturday. And they're angry, and they're protesting that their individual freedoms are being violated. And so, the question you would ask is, what is your value that you are holding? And the value is freedom. And then, at some point you'd have to explore what is freedom. And what happens when one freedom comes into conflict with somebody else's freedom? How do you work that out together? My freedom not to get sick, your freedom to not wear a mask or not be vaccinated. So we have conflicts of freedom. And first of all, some of the emotion has to de-escalate to kind of enter into dialogue. But at the same time, to have a rational conversation is to say, how can your freedom be protected, and how can the common good be promoted, and when those are in conflict, how can we deal with them? And then to have a conversation. But I have to admit and confess that in one of my treasured dialogues with my brother, we have to agree not to talk about politics. So, I think at that point, maybe that's a failure of dialogue. But you know, there are differences, and sometimes we don't transcend those differences. But with my brother, I transcend our political difference because we love one another. And somebody actually asked me, how can you be in a relationship with somebody who holds these positions? And I said, well, A, we agree not to talk about it. And B, the relationship is more important than the difference. It's imperfect.
Yes, like life itself. Well, now, you set for another one? You up to it? All right. All right. The synodal process specifically asks the local churches to reach out to other Christian denominations. This is clearly indicated in the preparatory documents. I think that's a comment. I don't know whether you want
That's good to know. That's great.
So you're happy with.
But when I was answering the question before, it wasn't that in the preparation we're reaching out for something. I was just wondering if they were actually going to be speaking participants at the synod. That's what I didn't know.
All right, well, there you are. So now you have an answer. See, you're getting an answer, which is nice to have a change.
That's dialogical.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And the next one just says, thank you for your presentation. Well done. So you're on the way here. There's looks about 6 more. So let's just see. Would it help to use the concrete word family rather than the abstraction of the term ecumenism?
I don't think they mean the same thing. A family is a family. You know, they're related to each other by blood. Ecumenism is the word actually comes from a word that's, you know, the koinonia, which is the whole kind of world.
Right.
And the ecumenism is, so I wouldn't want to say it's this family spirituality. You know, ecumenism is working that maybe we become more of a family, but it's, you're not a family, completely a family, or you're a family by adoption, part way. I don't know.
Well, that's what you're saying there. I'm seeing if there's anything else here. You know what? Let's just take a pause here. If anyone wants to put something into the chat box again, it looks to me like you're in pretty good shape here, Susan.
Well, thank you.
I'm seeing if there's any more. I see a couple doubles of the same, so that's not it. So let's take a moment. If not, here we are. Question. We can transcend tribalism if we're all children of God? Question mark.
Yes, I understand tribalism as being isolationism, everybody in their own silo. And what we're talking about is interconnectedness.
Okay. All right. And another one here says, is there one denomination that is closer than another?
To what? Us?
I would presume.
Well, the Orthodox, we affirm their apostolic succession, their sacraments, and their ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of closeness there. Yeah, there are differences of degrees of relationship. I would say we're probably the closest to the Orthodox. But what I tell my students always is that's an asymmetrical relationship, because Catholics want unity with the Orthodox more than the Orthodox want unity with the Catholics. The Protestant churches want more unity with Catholics sometimes than Catholics want with Protestant churches. It's asymmetrical all the way down. in terms of what we do. And even among the Protestant churches, they're not all the same, because, the Anglicans and the Lutherans have more in common with us than evangelicals or Pentecostals, both in terms of their church polity. They don't have the same kind of structures in terms of sacramental life. And then, as I said this morning to my class, we come closer in some areas to one another, and immediately there are other differences that open up, like there's a moral divide on some moral issues, for example.
Thank you. Well, there's another one that's come up here, and it says, how can TST be an institution to advance dialogue across churches in Canada among church leaders and members? And is this a collective goal at TST?
That's a good question. Well, TST is inherently ecumenical because it has 2 Anglican schools, 3 Roman Catholic schools, a Reformed school, and United Church of Christ school. We celebrated an ecumenical prayer service this week, yesterday, as a matter of fact. It's not as intentionally ecumenical as I think it was in its origins, and this is something we could work on harder with each other. We frankly spend most of our time on administration rather than talking about theological ideas or confessional differences. And if we could get beyond the administration and talk about more important things, I think, the ecumenical agenda would be one of them. And our focus tends to be as schools rather than in relationships with our churches, even though individuals in those schools serve on ecumenical teams in their churches. Like Chris Britton is a very respected ecumenist over at Trinity, for example.
All right. Well, we're winding down here, but there is another one that's come up, and you might get 1 or 2 more, and then we'll let you rest for the evening. It's been a long day, we know, for you. So here's a question. Could you elaborate on the difference you see between ecumenical dialogue and interreligious dialogue? Pope Francis says that there are spiritual gifts in the world's religions put there by the Holy Spirit. It sounds so similar to the beautiful idea of an ecumenical exchange of gifts.
Yes, there certainly can be an ecumenical exchange of, an exchange of gifts from other religions. I absolutely affirm that. But the goal is different because even though we can receive many fine gifts from non-Christian religions, the basis of the church in terms of the triune God and belief in Jesus Christ is not there in this, is just not there. And so Christianity was born out of a missionary, not Christianity itself, but the ecumenical movement was born out of a missionary endeavor among Protestant churches in 1910 in Edinburgh at a missionary conference, when they found that their evangelization of non-Christian peoples in their preaching the gospel was impeded by their lack of unity, because non-Christians would look at these, at the Christians who were fighting with one another and say, why would we want to be that, And so it was the missionary movement that was the foundation, and it was the preaching of the Christian message. And so we need to accept one another as Christians and deepen our life with one another. That is the goal of the ecumenical movement. The interreligious movement, yes, there's many gifts we can receive from one another, But the goal is not unity, because the question would be, what is the basis of that unity? And it wouldn't be belief in Christ.
All right, thank you. I think this is your last question tonight. In terms of conversion and the development of religious life, is there support for monastic communities similar to the Catholic worker movement?
Okay. Is there support for monastic communities? Absolutely. I sometimes think the monastic communities have more longevity than the apostolic communities, because historically they go back much, much further, and there's a kind of decline, a growth and decline movement of apostolic communities. They come into existence for a reason, and then they diminish, and then a new form of religious life emerges. So yes, monastic communities would continue. The Catholic worker movement is not a monastic community, however. The Catholic worker movement, comes out of Dorothy Day and her work with the poor and social justice, and her Catholic worker houses. And that certainly speaks to a conversion in terms of listening to the poor and living with the poor, and serving for social justice. So I wouldn't compare monasticism with Catholic worker movement, but they both have their own emphasis on conversion. Because actually the Benedictine vow, main vow, is conversion of life.
Well, I think we will let you rest here on that word of life. That was your last word, life. And I'd like to say, on behalf of leadership and the planning committee and the participants who are here with us tonight, you said it was a provocative title, you thought, putting it beyond, as you called it. But I think it was also evocative, and the questions certainly have shown the scope and the gamut of different range of where people found themselves as they listened to you tonight. So thank you, Susan, for this. And to those, I also thank the tech support. I told them that this had to be said because they're paying me to say it. But it's just that in this week of Mary Ward and of Christian unity, to have a talk like this tonight and the amount of work that you put into it, what I'm left with is what a great teacher you are. Tremendous teaching. Really, I'm sure people would agree to that. And I see already a thanks so much with an exclamation mark. And if anyone else wants to put in the chats can be put onto the screen. You can see them as we're going. But may you rest tonight. Thank you very much for saying yes to us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's been fun.
And there's lots of, wonderful presentation, excellent presentation. Can you read them yourself? Can you see them?
Well, I wasn't looking at them earlier because I was just listening to the question and trying to answer it.
I concur. Susan's a great teacher. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed. What a wonderful presentation, enlightening, excellent. Yay for Sister of Charity. I think you've got somebody you paid them well at home.
Teresa Vanguard is one of our sisters.
Okay, well, there you are. Yes, excellent presentation. Thank you to all those who made it possible, and I agree. And certainly to the planning committee, Michelle, Robert, Emily, Anne, Sarah, Petite, Julie, Mary. I hope I've said them all. They certainly put it together and they've made it happen. And so we say thank you to all. And as we go, you can see what people are saying. I think this was an energizing, enlightening evening. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody.